Welcome, everyone. You're still awake after lunch, right? I'll keep you there, I hope. I want to first start with why I think this is an important subject for you. But before I do that, I really want to thank the EBVC group on behalf of Diamond V Europe and our Rumenco partners here for bringing me out to the United Kingdom. Really enjoyed this trip so far. My wife's traveling with me, and you've been nothing but gracious hosts. And I've got a chance to be on a couple of your farms yesterday, so really appreciate that. I do know how tough this market is for you. We've had many like this in the U.S., and I do want to encourage you to stay with your vision of feeding the world. I think that's a worthy one, and we do have a growing population that still need food. Despite the cycles that we're in, I think it's something that you'll achieve greatness in your life, and I promise to bring you some value to help you do that through my presentation. So as I prepared for this, I did some reading, and I looked at this article in the Farmers Weekly. And Bill, do I get a pointer from you? Is that yours, or is there?
It's running out of gas.
Thank you very much. So pretty recently, back in April, this article was published in the Farmers Weekly that talked about how do you compete in this global market. And we look obviously at the UK and where our milk price is, look at Ireland as well. Also the US. This was back in January. But the big thing that we see obviously is these double-digit declines that you've had recently. And so we know how difficult that is. So we look further at this and some statistics that I gathered from this briefing paper back in January. What's interesting to me, if you go back about 10 years, the bright spot in your milk price has been due to cheese and cream increase in consumption. On the other hand, the milk powder consumption has dropped significantly. And that's really similar to what we're seeing in the States and globally, I think. So I believe globally in the future, and I'm seeing it at the consumer level. When you read the newspaper, we're seeing some good words about milk fat, right? We are seeing it finally in the U.S. where butter is now more accepted. We have butter in our house, and as a kid, much more margarine. And I think that's changing. So for the future, we're seeing this. And you can see it for our milk price here, based on the National Agricultural Statistics Service and the Agricultural Marketing Service. Going back to 2007, you would see that butter and non-fat dry milk price kind of paralleled each other. Until early 2014, we see this dramatic divergence. The powder price dropped dramatically, where butter, although volatile, has increased. And I think you'll see that the same. I know it's a high utilization country here in the United Kingdom, but I do believe milk fat is going to be key for your milk price. And I look at that further, looking at the UK wholesale prices. So we have butter, cheddar, etc. on this graph. And what I noticed here, in your last downturn, which was late 2011, pretty sharp drop in the wholesale price, but your recent downturn is much less. So the butter price isn't dropping as significantly as our powder price. Also, reading a little further, about a year ago, your chief executive of the Royal Association of British Dairy Farms suggested to maximize milk price goes through optimizing the components or maximizing the components. So in summary, here's my summary point, so you can go to sleep after this slide if you do need to. To maximize milk price, avoid milk fat depression. But I do want to make sure you understand whether or not it's real or not. And that's where I get to help a little bit. So I posed a question in your teaser for this. Milk fat's been dropping for the last 3 months. Is it milk fat depression? So I want you to think about that question. Got one no. So who thinks you've been dropping milk fat for the last 3 months? Who thinks that's milk fat depression? Got one up here. Who thinks it's not? Who wants to bury their head in the sand and not think about milk price right now? But so I do want you to think further about that, and I'll share some thoughts on it. So also I'll finish up with how do you know and how does it happen? Okay, so let me just give you a little bit of background from my perspective. So I'm one of, like many of you, a technical consultant in the U.S. I live up here in the Pacific Northwest. This is Oregon, where my home is. As a young person, I left the area and went to graduate school down at the University of Florida. So I got as far away as I could from home to study. Got involved a little bit of heat stress, but one of the things that really impacted me was empirical modeling. So that's when we had no idea. Warwick, you're in here, you probably remember the card reader cards that they handed you, and you don't want to drop those because they're very important to put them back in. But that's the data that Dr. Beatty gave me to try to assemble the DCAD relationships back then, and we did that and found some interesting relationships with that empirical modeling approach. And I want to talk to you about that a little bit more. After that, I went up to the University of Idaho, where I was a professor in one of the growing states in the country. And then I left. I was kind of isolated up there, and I really liked working in the industry and being closer to farms. So I left, and I continued to work mainly here. But I worked for a couple companies. One was out here, so I spent a lot of time in the east. And then my current company, Diamond V, is based here in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And so I get into that part of the world. But most of my time is here in the western U.S., and all of these are our regional managers that I spend a lot of time with. I also spent a lot of time with a large dairy in Utah doing some of the work I'll talk to you about. Okay, so that's my perspective on life, just to give you where I'm coming from. See if I can keep advancing this. In the Pacific Northwest, I did want to give you this image. This is a farmer, which is many like yours today. We have beautiful countryside. This countryside is very similar to what you see driving down the road. The big difference is we have lots of forest in our neck of the woods, but many farms just like yours in the Pacific Northwest, that Oregon region that I live in. I also get on the big dairies, and the typical dairies, this is very average now, are California dairies, all good. These producers are good producers and they love their cows, but we just have bigger farms now in the U.S., especially in California. So that empirical modeling project, I always had an interest in data. So this is milk and fat-corrected milk shipments, and I put this in kilograms per day. And we've assembled a database of 168 U.S. Holstein herds. And this is our DV Monitors database. And these herds are about 2,500 cows. So they are our progressive, larger farms, averaging 36 kilograms of milk and 37 kilograms of fat-corrected milk per day. So here's your kilograms of milk shipped per day from those farms or fat-corrected milk. The fat-corrected milk's in blue and the milk's in red. So what you're seeing, and this goes back 3 years to 2013 to current. So what you're seeing is obviously some cyclicity, some seasonal patterns in milk flow, which happens a lot, both in the north and in the south in our regions. But what I'm seeing is the separation between the raw milk here in red and the fat-corrected milk. Our producers have figured out how to produce more fat-corrected milk compared to milk. And here lately, they've really gotten good at it. See that increase? This milk's flat, but fat-corrected milk is increasing. So they know what they're getting paid on, which is more on butter fat now, and they're using the technologies to increase fat-corrected milk relative. We're seeing about a 2% increase per year. So this is your global market, and I really encourage you and your producers to consider producing more fat-corrected milk and getting a higher milk price for your dairies. Taking this further, this is 7 years of data. Now we have 206 Holstein herds, and now we take out the flow out of this. This is just the percentage of milk fat and protein in our bulk tank. And you see again that very cyclic pattern. And you knew this. You knew that butter fat's high in the winter and low in the summer. But did you know that protein follows that same pattern? That was one of the big ahas when we looked at this database. And so many would say that this is due to heat stress. It's not. We see the same pattern in our northern climates as our southern climates. Okay, so that's the US. What about the UK? There's your pattern from the UK. I pulled this from the DEFRA website that shows over the last 5 years, here's your butter fat, very cyclic pattern in the UK. Here's your protein from your your government association that's providing this information. So it's very similar here in the UK as we see in the US. Obviously, it's a higher number, and I'll talk about that more. That's probably more due to lower production and dilution. Okay, so here's my perspective again. Here's the US. I'm looking at 5 regions that make up this database, and here's our UK. We do know that there's a regional difference. In our southern climates, this is the southwest region of the US, we see lower butter fats, up to 2 to maybe even a little bit higher point differentials compared to, this is the Pacific Northwest where I live, California, upper Midwest. So there definitely is a regional difference, but you again see that pattern across regions. It's the same in the north as it is in the south. We don't know why, and that's not what I'm going to be here discussing. I'm just going to show you this information and encourage you to look at it closer for yourself. So, but I do want to be a little bit more familiar, so I'm going to take a closer look at our Pacific Northwest compared to the UK, which is in that more northern climate in the US. Here's the last 3 years. Now we have 54 farms. These are Holsteins in the Pacific Northwest. And again, there's that very cyclic pattern, very reproducible year after year from the last 3 years. And what we find is that around January, December, January, we see the highs of the year. And in July, we see the lows. And it's very predictable. So let's further ask that question. What do you see here in the UK? The last 3 years, I've just zeroed this scale in for you. Again, you're a little bit higher than we are, at 4.1 for, and I don't have it separated by breed, so I don't know if your crossbred herds or your Jerseys are contributing to this, but I know it's mostly Holsteins, right, here in the UK, that's giving you that pattern. And then if we lay that on just 1 year, so now we have 2013, 14, and 15 from January to December. You very clearly see that pattern that forms. And so the answer to the question is, you saw the butter fat drop for 3 straight months. Here we are in June. Is it milk fat depression as you're visiting your farms? No, it's not. It's a seasonal pattern that's really predictable. So I wanted to give you that information, that insight that I share with lots of nutritionists and consultants in the West. And this is very confidence building when you have this information and you can get that phone call from the producer who says, hey, my butter fat's dropping, you better do something or I'm going to change to another nutritionist. And then calm them down and say, no, it's a seasonal pattern. We're seeing that across all of our farms. Okay, that was the first thing. Is it real or not? So I wanted to make sure I covered this area, season of the year. Does anybody else have a pointer? Okay, I'll just point I've used Bill's battery twice now, but so we'll focus. We talked about season of the year. That's over in the far right. There's also obviously other factors related to stage of lactation, milk yield. I mentioned obviously higher producing cows have lower butter fat. Breed, obviously we know their jerseys, crossbreds are higher. Genetics, many of our breeding efforts have been to higher production and lower components. And some of these other things that we'll talk about. The big thing we all talk about, thanks.
I don't know how good it'll work.
Man, you're okay, the button in the middle. We're out of juice here, but I know someone else will come up here. So a lot of us focus on that left side, diet formulation, as the only thing that we're interested in. So I just wanted to make sure you look through this whole table here. And I've summarized all the things which I'll be talking about in other talks tomorrow about, where you have ration-driven factors and then these other factors that are important to consider before you talk about milk fat depression. Thank you, Michael.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I got to turn this on.
It is on.
Okay, point that. I got similar one, and my battery's low as well. But anyway, you guys I'll encourage you to. I'll tell you where to look anyway. So we're going to move on to some of these other details right now. But in summary, we're going to maximize our milk price by avoiding milk fat depression. Actually, let me check my time, because this was, being that I'm going to be here for several talks, 2:30, 2:34, I've got most of my information on that we've covered, so we'll have lots of time for discussion probably. Is it real or not? And then, so the answer to that question, obviously we don't know, but we don't think it is milk fat depression based on the charts that we see from the UK. So how do you know, and how does it happen? Looking at this information, hey, thanks, Wark. Here he comes with the rescue. Thank you. Here's this. Red button. Do you see anything? There we go. Okay. Perfect. It's over here. Oh, it's over here. So again, yeah, this always rattles you, the technology, like a pointer. You got to slow down and relax here a little bit. So again, we'll talk more in detail about these items, but a really good talk for you to review from this conference back in March, the Total Dairy Expo. Will Tully covered this in great detail, and it was great that he did that, and I got to review it to remind you. But this stage of lactation we'll get into, parity, milk yield we mentioned, breed, and genetics. So before we get too far into this whole subject, I just again want to reemphasize for you to determine whether or not you have a real issue. So the next one I want to cover is this stage of lactation. And this was confusing for me because I know that, like the farm I visited yesterday is a fall calving farm. And so we have some of these seasonal grazing operations that really confuse this when we try to overlay that on top of our normal seasonal pattern. So we look at stage of lactation. And what we did on this is we took a database from 9 western U.S. dairies, 27,000 cows, and plotted that by days in milk, and then recorded the standard deviation. So that's that table up through 210 days in milk here, and here it is visually. So you know this as well, but it does give you a nice standard deviation number to look at. But as we go from 0 to 30 days in milk, 31 to 60, 61 to 90, 91 to 120, etc., we see that milk fat drops with our lactation curve. In our 9 western U.S. dairies, certainly gets down to a pretty low number at our peak milk. And I think that's due to production. As you see on this next graph, these herds are hitting 43, 42 kilos of milk per day at that peak production, at the same time where we see this butter fat at the bottom. So that relationship is real, and it's pretty strong. When you lay over that seasonal pattern with your stage of lactation, then you can really even further understand if you have these seasonal calvers, you're going to have to look at that. If they're all at peak milk now, they're going to be low in addition to our seasonal pattern. If their peak milk's in the wintertime for a fall calving herd, that's going to be opposite. It's going to be lower in that wintertime relative to that stage of lactation. And thank you, Rich Vacare, for providing me some of the information. This is a large database from a herd example from the UK that we clearly see that same relationship. They're at peak milk around a little bit before 100 days in milk. You see that bottom of that nadir in butterfat based on the days in milk, that stage of lactation curve. So obviously, I'm sure you understood that, but laying that on top of the seasonal pattern, I think is important. Okay, this now takes a little closer look at some of our smaller herds in the Pacific Northwest. Now we have 11 herds over the last 3 years. The black line is our average. There's that seasonal pattern, but now you see the variation. Okay, the variation is valuable because now you can look at those herds that deviate quite a bit from our average. And here we have one herd example that's the bottom. And so what we have now is the average in red of our Pacific Northwest Holstein farms, less than 500 cows. And look at the number now. It's much closer to where you are, the 3940% butterfat, compared to a single dairy that had been lower, but it had paralleled this until this last year. So this is a farm I would look closer at to suggest we've got some milk fat depression because of that deviation from its peer group. And so I guess my point is for you to take this information like I've done and start creating your peer groups for your producers that you're working with so that you know what that pattern is and how the single farms compare. So to summarize at this point now, is it real or not? Absolutely look at that seasonal pattern. Look at our stage of lactation. And then, if you can, create a peer group. And I don't know if you have those in your hands or if they exist, but this data has now become mostly electronic. For us in the States, we have every load of milk posted on a website that we're downloading and then doing a weighted average with that information. I hear some of the farms here are giving you twice a week, every other day type of information. There's so much data here that I think it would be valuable to pull that together and create your peer groups by regions. Obviously, the Irish region's probably different from our southern UK areas. And again, the answer, has it been dropping for the last 3 months? It doesn't appear to be based on our seasonal pattern. So how do you know and how does it happen? This review article, this review presentation by Will Tully was really excellent. He really went into the biology of how does this happen. So I'm going to defer to that for your presentation here. We'll talk at great length in our workshops tomorrow, and I've got one more talk, a lecture tomorrow as well on this subject that I'll take you through some of the case studies where we've taken this information, looked at it closely, and applied our current science to what's going on in the field. But the bottom line in all of this is really two simple areas of nutrition, the carbohydrate area and the fat area. And those two contribute to our rumen function. So really that's the bottom line, and all of this milk fat management is focusing on the rumen. The confusing part is there's many other factors other than diet, other than carbohydrates and fats, that affect the rumen function and interact to affect milk fat synthesis. What Will Tully told you in that video is that we developed this trans-10 cis-12 fatty acid that's the potent milk fat depressor that's produced in the rumen, and by its travel to the small intestine and absorption at the mammary gland, it sits on that mammary gland fat synthesis gene and inhibits that production. And we can severely drop butterfat from, the data's amazing, 3.5 down to 2.5, for example, with just a few grams of this potent milk fat depressor. And I'll talk quite a bit more about that. So here are the major drivers, again, of herd milk fat percent and yield. And my whole point in this first presentation was to talk about, is it real or not? So we've covered season of the year, stage of lactation, parity, I mentioned, but as you know, the higher producing, the older cows produce more milk and less butterfat percent than our first lactation animals. Milk yield then is correlated, and then our breed, the genetics, the breeding. We are all looking closer at breeding for more components now. The Jersey has really entered our market, like in the Pacific Northwest, California. A lot of producers are turning towards Jerseys because of this future increase in butterfat impact on milk price. We'll talk a little bit about some of the intake, fill, and rumination. It was mentioned by Dr. Weiss and Dr. Lane on inflammation, disease, etc., and its relationship to milk fat and individual cow factors. Obviously, again, as nutritionists, we focus a lot on diet formulation. We'll speak tomorrow about the rumen unsaturated fats, the fermentable carbohydrates, the effective fiber. I won't mention it specifically in my talk, but rumen available nitrogen and its effect on rumen bacteria is a critical factor as well, especially if you're short. Generally, we're not, but if you end up being short on available nitrogen. Rumen buffering, I won't talk about in much detail, but obviously you know about that and other rumen modifiers. Water quality is sometimes one of those rare issues that we have with especially sulfites in the water, for example, that can affect the rumen. Nutrient analysis, this is a critical one. Dr. Weiss will be covering that in some of his presentations. Understanding the nutrient composition really it requires us to get some more complete nutritional analysis. And then this whole area of management. I really think when you're looking at a milk fat depression, these are the factors that really come out. It's feeding management, and that's been an area that Diamond V's focused on extensively as really the solution to many of these mysteries that we think are nutrition related, but it's actually just preparing the diet correctly. Silage quality, some of the spoilage compounds in the silage affect rumen fermentation and inhibit some of our fiber bacteria, for example. Silage storage time, etc. And like I said, mixing, delivery, timing of feeding times per day. Sometimes we get too sophisticated and try to feed cows too many times a day, and they're out of feed before we actually realize it. So sometimes just feeding enough is the solution. Moisture is a big issue that's come up. Sounds very simple, but with too dry of a ration, we get sorting and we get cows with low milk fat. And then the consistency. So the management consistency is really one of the keys to the successful producers in the U.S. and how they are producing more fat-corrected milk. They're just focusing on doing the same thing. Cows like a very consistent daily habit, and so providing that consistency has been a really key solution to remind them. And none of these things cost money. Moisture, adding some more water to the ration, mixing it correctly, or just doing things consistently don't cost anything and can pay great dividends, as you know. And then this whole area of doing partial grazing and partial TMRs, that's a very sophisticated thing that you guys do, and you're very talented at it. The farm yesterday was amazing how they can put together the understanding of grazing along with feeding a high-quality TMR. So you really have your work cut out for you to be good at all these areas, and I think that's how you'll be successful. Stocking density is one we'll talk about at great length tomorrow. As our farms have gotten bigger, sometimes they're full, and you want to maximize your milk production if they're not putting caps on your milk, and all of a sudden you have too many cows, and again, the feeding behavior, the sorting, the stress that is related to that. Interesting little side, in 2009 when we had our major milk price crisis, it was truly a crisis. Producers, the milk processors put a cap on production. And so these producers had to sell cows. And so they would go into their farms and sell cows, and milk went up. So you're selling cows and milk went up. That was a very teachable moment on overcrowding. We had too many cows in there. You give them enough space, and all of a sudden you're feeding a lot less cows and you're getting more milk. So they had to go cull even more cows to drop their total production. So that was a teachable moment that's hard to realize in a normal day-to-day thing. So that would be great if that was a solution for you guys. Grouping management, the movements, the social behaviors, milking equipment, a big area, milk sample handling, sometimes just adequately mixing the milk tank and what the sample that they use is being measured and giving you that number. Reproduction, it's actually a pretty critical area to focus on. That's been a real big strength of our U.S. producers. The milk production, reproduction success has allowed them to control things and really dial in their production rather than suffering and not getting cows pregnant when you want to, which then rolls right into the time budgets. The time budgets of these cows, they're not getting enough time to rest, and they're up, and there's too much chaos on our farms in many cases, again affecting the speed of their intake or sorting and affecting milk fat. Cooling has become a big focus for our industry. Even up where I live in the Pacific Northwest, cooling cows adequately in summer definitely affects milk fat as it's related to the rumen buffering, acid base, the respiratory panting issues, etc. So cooling cows, and I think it will come into play even in a higher altitude place like the UK. And again, consistency. So how am I doing, Sam?
We have 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
It's 3 o'clock.
So you don't mind if I finish early? Get your break? Okay, good. So I'm going to finish up with some summary points. To maximize milk price, avoid milk fat depression. That's a real profound statement, right? Obviously, we want to maximize milk fat without losing milk, and I'll talk about that. That's going to be my focus. All the strategies that we talk about, we're not giving up milk to get more milk fat. We're at least keeping milk the same, or sometimes increasing milk and increasing milk fat on the farm, on the cows that we have to really maximize the milk price and efficiency on our dairies. But again, milk fat depression, is it real or not? Study those seasonal patterns, prepare your peer group, to really understand this. So the question, milk fat's been dropping for the last 3 months. Is it milk fat depression? No, it's a seasonal decline. You're close to the bottom of your normal pattern. And in the fall, you'll start coming back up again and you'll hit your highs in December, January. I really suggest that's going to be the case. It definitely depends on the time of year, the stage of lactation that you overlay onto those individual farms, as well as many of these other factors that I'm going to be talking about in additional talks. So how do you know and how does it happen? Definitely refer to Will Tully's video presentation, a nice one from our Total Dairy Expo back in March. Try to create a peer group, whether it's just 11 farms or 50 farms. Look at those seasonal patterns regionally, by breed, by milking, 2X, 3X, those type of things. Pool these things together to have that peer group that you can focus your individual dairies on. And then all the factors lead to the rumen. So focus on our rumen as a key to maximizing milk fat and maximizing milk price. Thanks very much.
Well, Bill, thank you very much for that very relevant and great talk. It's great to see butter back in vogue, isn't it? And taking the space back in our refrigerator. So we do have some time before we break for coffee for some questions. I'm certain that has provoked some questions in the audience. So if I could just get a show of hands. We've got the roving mics here again. And just to remind you, if you could just add the context of introducing yourself and where you're from, that would be really helpful. So looking around, who's going to kick us off with the first question for Bill?
Can I ask a question?
Controversial.
Only if it's an easy one, Bill.
Is it milk fat depression if fat percent goes down but yield doesn't change?
And thanks for that reminder. I'll clarify what I believe milk fat depression is. It's a reduction in yield. So sometimes, like our high-producing cow, the butter fat percent is lower, but our milk is up. So it's not milk fat depression. The yield of fat is the same or higher. I'm suggesting milk fat depression is when you have a reduction in grams or yield of fat. We use percent to guide us. It's a very easy value to get, but obviously that's the answer.
Pete Kelly, dairy consultant. Your seasonal variations in milk fat map the hours of darkness in the UK. So as we get more hours of darkness, percentage of milk fat goes up. What's your experience of artificial lighting and how many hours should we have and what level of intensity?
A very, very insightful question. If you heard him, he was talking about the hours of daylight, really mapping that. And we think that's the case. Again, you look at milk protein following that same pattern. It could be, and this is where we need some research on it. Artificial lighting was the question, and it appears to be related. There's very few parts of the world that we can control that darkness, though. There's these cross-ventilated barns that are showing up. And I've talked to those producers, and their butter fats are even because they follow that 12 hours of light, 12 hours of dark for those lactating cows. So I believe artificial light is one of the solutions for the future. I don't know how practical that is, because again, if like me and my wife trying to catch up to this time zone, if the window shades open at all, you got that light coming in, and it's affecting you physiologically. So thanks for that question.
Thank you. Great question. Do we have any more questions from the audience? I don't think we do. Bill, thank you very much indeed.